There's a room in St. Petersburg where the floorboards still bear the stains. Not of wine spilled during grand celebrations, not of mud tracked in from gardens, but something far darker. The guides don't point it out to tourists anymore. They walk past it quickly, their practiced smiles never quite reaching their eyes. But if you know what you're looking for, if you trace your fingers along the restored parquet in the basement of a certain house on Voznesensky Avenue, you can still feel the history. You can still sense what happened there on that July night in 1918, when the most powerful dynasty in the world discovered that all the palaces, all the gold, all the crowns and thrones and imperial majesty meant absolutely nothing when faced with 11 bullets and the cold certainty of revolution. The Romanovs didn't just own palaces. They collected them. They built them. They poured the wealth of an entire nation, spanning 11 time zones and millions upon millions of subjects, into creating monuments to their own divinity. And in the end, those very monuments became their prison, their downfall, and their tomb. This is the story of those palaces. The places where emperors walked on floors more valuable than entire villages, where children played in rooms that cost more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes, where every surface dripped with gold, while outside, in the streets, people starved and froze and bled in wars they never wanted to fight. This is about what happens when excess becomes so extreme that it stops being real, when luxury becomes a bubble so complete that you can't see outside it anymore. And this is about how that bubble eventually, inevitably, has to burst. But let's start where it truly began. Not with the execution, not with the revolution, but in 1613, when a 16-year-old boy named Michael Romanov was dragged from a monastery and told he was going to be Tsar of all Russia. He didn't want the job. His mother begged them to find someone else. The last few years had been catastrophic for Russia, a period so dark they simply called it the time of troubles. Famines, invasions, pretenders to the throne, Moscow itself had burned, and they wanted this teenager to fix it all. Michael agreed, reluctantly, and with that decision, he started something that would last just over 300 years and would reach heights of power and wealth that would have seemed impossible to imagine back in that monastery. 300 years. 3 centuries of accumulation, of building, of taking the resources of the largest country on earth and funneling them into creating palaces that would make the gods themselves jealous. Think about what you can build in 300 years. The United States isn't even 250 years old yet. In 300 years, the Romanovs went from a frightened boy in a monastery to owning approximately 400 palaces, estates, and imperial residences scattered across their empire. 400. Let that number settle in your mind for a moment. Not one palace, not 2 or 3. 400 properties that belonged personally to the imperial family. Now, most of those were hunting lodges, country estates, smaller properties. But among them were some of the most spectacular buildings ever created. Structures so grand, so impossibly ornate, that even today, even after decades of Soviet rule that tried to erase the very memory of the Romanovs, they still leave you breathless when you see them. The Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, the Catherine Palace with its amber room, Peterhof, the Russian Versailles with its hundreds of fountains and golden statues, the Alexander Palace, where the last Tsar actually preferred to live because it was more, and I'm using this word very carefully here, modest. These weren't just homes, they were statements. They were declarations written in marble and gold that said, "We are not like you. We are chosen by God. We are more than human, and you will never, ever reach us up here in our palaces in the sky." Except people did reach them, eventually. Let's talk about the Winter Palace first, because if there's one building that captures the sheer insanity of Romanov excess, it's this one. Picture this. You're standing in Palace Square in St. Petersburg on a cold winter morning in, say, 1910. In front of you rises a building that stretches nearly 800 feet long, with a facade painted in its distinctive pale green and white. It has 1,786 doors, 826 rooms, 1,945 windows, 117 staircases, and every single inch of it screams wealth and power. The Winter Palace wasn't built all at once. It went through multiple iterations, but the version we're talking about, the one that still stands today, was completed under Empress Elizabeth, Peter the Great's daughter, in 1762. She wanted something that would outshine Versailles, that would make every European monarch who saw it understand that Russia wasn't some backward frozen wasteland on the edge of civilization. Russia was a power. Russia was magnificent. Russia had an empress who could command an army of thousands of craftsmen and artists to create something that had never been seen before. The architect was Bartolomeo Rastrelli, an Italian who understood the assignment perfectly. He gave Elizabeth exactly what she wanted. A palace so enormous, so lavishly decorated that it almost doesn't look real. The main staircase, the Jordan staircase, is a masterpiece of white marble, gold gilding, and mirrors that multiply everything into infinity. You climb those stairs and you're meant to feel small, overwhelmed, utterly insignificant in the face of imperial grandeur. That was the point. The throne room, the staterooms, the private apartments. They're all designed to impress, to intimidate, to remind everyone who enters that they are in the presence of absolute power. The ceilings soar 40, 50 feet overhead, covered in frescoes and elaborate molding dripping with gold. The floors are intricate parquet, different woods fitted together in geometric patterns that would take modern craftsmen years to replicate. The walls are covered in silk, in leather, in paintings by the greatest masters Europe had to offer. And here's the thing that really gets you when you start thinking about it. This was just one palace, just one of many. The Romanovs would come here for the winter social season, for balls and receptions and state occasions. But they had other palaces for other times of the year, for different moods, for when they wanted something quieter or more intimate or more connected to nature. Catherine the Great, who took the throne in 1762 after her husband Peter III was, let's be diplomatic here, removed from power. She understood the importance of these palaces, perhaps better than anyone. Catherine wasn't born Russian. She was a minor German princess who married into the Romanov family and then seized power in a coup. She knew that her legitimacy was questionable, that many considered her a usurper. So she built. She collected. She turned herself into a patron of the arts and architecture on a scale that defied belief. Under Catherine, the Winter Palace became home to one of the greatest art collections in the world. She bought entire collections from European nobles who had fallen on hard times. Paintings by Rembrandt, Rubens, Raphael, Leonardo, sculptures, drawings, precious objects, books. She created the Hermitage, initially as a private retreat where she could escape the formality of court life and view her treasures, but which eventually grew into multiple buildings attached to the Winter Palace, housing hundreds of thousands of artworks. Catherine also understood something crucial about palaces and power. She understood that they had to evolve, they had to grow, they had to constantly be renovated and improved. A static palace was a statement of a static reign, and Catherine was anything but static. She expanded Russia's borders dramatically. She crushed rebellions. She corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot and positioned herself as an enlightened monarch, even while millions of serfs lived in conditions that were barely distinguishable from slavery. The Catherine Palace, named after Catherine I but largely associated with Catherine the Great, sits about 15 miles south of St. Petersburg in the town of Pushkin, formerly called Tsarskoye Selo, the Tsar's village. This is where Baroque architecture goes absolutely wild. If the Winter Palace is impressive, the Catherine Palace is intoxicating. It's blue and white and gold, stretching out in a facade that seems to go on forever. Every column topped with golden capitals, every window surrounded by elaborate white decorations against that distinctive blue. But the real treasure of the Catherine Palace, the thing that made it legendary, was the Amber Room. Imagine a room, not large by palace standards, maybe about 30 feet by 30 feet, but where every single wall is covered, floor to ceiling, not with paint or wallpaper or silk, but with panels of amber. Real Baltic amber, 6 tons of it, carved and fitted together in elaborate designs, backed with gold leaf so that when the candles were lit, the entire room seemed to glow from within. It was warm and golden and alive in a way that no other room in any palace anywhere could match. The Amber Room was originally created in Prussia and given to Peter the Great in 1716. It was installed in the Winter Palace first, but later moved to the Catherine Palace where it was expanded and enhanced. People called it the 8th wonder of the world. Artists and nobles would travel from across Europe just to see it. And here's the dark part of this story, though not the darkest yet. During World War II, when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, they disassembled the Amber Room and took it to Königsberg. It disappeared after that. Gone. 6 tons of irreplaceable amber, one of the most magnificent rooms ever created, lost forever in the chaos of war. The room you can see in the Catherine Palace today is a reconstruction, completed only in 2003, painstakingly recreated over decades by craftsmen who studied old photographs and documents. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the glory days, to when these palaces were alive with the Romanov family and their court, when the amber still glowed in its original splendor. Peterhof. If the Winter Palace was about power, and the Catherine Palace was about beauty, Peterhof was about defiance. Peter the Great built it as Russia's answer to Versailles, and like everything Peter did, he approached it with manic energy and absolute determination. He wanted fountains, lots of fountains, more fountains than anyone had ever seen. So he built a complex system of parks and cascades and water features that to this day remains one of the most impressive engineering achievements of the 18th century. The Grand Cascade, which flows down from the palace to the Gulf of Finland, features 64 fountains and more than 200 bronze sculptures, most of them gilded in gold. The centerpiece is the statue of Samson tearing open the jaws of a lion, commemorating Russia's victory over Sweden. Water shoots up from the lion's mouth in a jet that reaches 70 feet high. The sound of all that water, all those fountains running at once, creates a constant background roar that must have been almost overwhelming during the grand celebrations. Peter designed much of Peterhof himself, sketching out his ideas and driving the architects and engineers mad with his demands. He wanted it done quickly, he wanted it done grandly, and he didn't care how much it cost or how difficult it was. The palace itself went through numerous expansions and renovations over the years, each ruler adding their own touch. But the basic concept remained Peter's. This was a summer palace, a place to escape the heat of St. Petersburg, but also a place to host foreign dignitaries and show them that Russia could match anything Europe had to offer. The interiors of Peterhof are, predictably, spectacular. The throne room, the ballroom, the various ceremonial halls, they're all designed on a scale that's hard to wrap your mind around. But there's also something almost playful about parts of Peterhof. The trick fountains hidden in the pathways that would spray unsuspecting guests. The Montplaisir Palace, a smaller residence on the grounds that Peter used as a personal retreat. The Hermitage Pavilion, where a table could be lowered to the kitchen below and raised back up laden with food, allowing the Tsar and his guests to dine without servants present. These palaces, all of them, they existed in a kind of bubble. Inside, everything was perfect. Outside, the vast majority of Russians lived in conditions that hadn't changed much since medieval times. Serfdom, which was essentially slavery by another name, kept millions of people bound to the land, the property of nobles who could buy and sell them, split up families, punish them however they saw fit. The wealth that built these palaces was extracted from those people, from their labor in the fields, from the taxes they paid, from the resources pulled from the earth of the empire. And here's where the story starts to get truly dark, where we begin to see the cracks that would eventually bring the whole system crashing down. In December 1825, when Alexander I died and his brother Nicholas was set to take the throne, a group of military officers staged a revolt. They wanted constitutional reform, an end to autocracy, abolition of serfdom. They marched their troops to Senate Square in St. Petersburg, right in front of the Winter Palace, and refused to swear allegiance to Nicholas. For hours they stood there while Nicholas gathered loyal troops. Finally, Nicholas gave the order to fire. Canister shot tore through the rebels. The official death toll was listed as 71, but witnesses spoke of hundreds of bodies. The snow in Senate Square turned red. The bodies were dumped through holes in the ice of the Neva River. Nicholas I would go on to rule for 30 years, earning the nickname the Policeman of Europe for his brutal suppression of any hint of reform or revolution. He expanded the secret police, cracked down on dissent, sent thousands to Siberia. But he also continued the tradition of palace building and renovation. He couldn't help himself. It was what Romanov Tsars did. The thing about Nicholas, and this is true of so many of the Romanovs, is that he genuinely believed in the divine right of kings. He believed that God had placed him on the throne, that questioning his authority was not just political dissent, but actual blasphemy. And if God had given him this power, then surely he deserved to live in surroundings that reflected his elevated status. The palaces weren't excess, they were appropriate to his station. They were necessary. This mindset, this absolute conviction in their own specialness, it permeated every aspect of Romanov life. The servants who staffed these palaces, thousands of them, they weren't just employees. Many were serfs, property, who could be punished or dismissed or sent away at a whim. The craftsmen who maintained the gold leaf, who polished the parquet floors, who tended the elaborate gardens, they were part of a vast machine dedicated to maintaining this illusion of perfection. Alexander II, who became Tsar in 1855, actually tried to reform the system. He freed the serfs in 1861, a monumental change that ended centuries of bondage for millions of people. But freedom without land or resources or opportunity meant that many former serfs ended up barely better off than before. And the change came too late, too slow, too incomplete. Revolutionary movements grew. In 1881, revolutionaries threw a bomb at Alexander's carriage as he traveled through St. Petersburg. He survived that first bomb. He got out of his damaged carriage to check on the injured, and then a second revolutionary threw another bomb right at his feet. His legs were shattered. He was carried back to the Winter Palace, bleeding to death, leaving a trail of blood on those pristine floors. He died in his study a few hours later. His son, Alexander III, responded by cracking down even harder. More repression, more secret police, more arrests and exile, and more palace building, more renovations, more accumulation of art and treasures. The Romanovs, it seemed, had learned nothing, or perhaps they simply couldn't learn. They were trapped in their own palaces, surrounded by luxury so complete that they couldn't see outside anymore. Let's talk about the Alexander Palace for a moment, because this is where the last Tsar, Nicholas II, preferred to live with his family. It's smaller than the Winter Palace, more intimate, built originally by Catherine the Great for her grandson. The rooms are still grand by any normal standard, but there's something almost homey about parts of it, at least compared to the overwhelming formality of the other imperial residences. Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra, a German princess who converted to Orthodox Christianity, they tried to create a private family life in the Alexander Palace. They had 5 children, 4 daughters, and finally a son, Alexei, the heir to the throne. The family photos from this period are almost painfully normal. Nicholas playing with his children, teaching them to ride bicycles, swimming with them, posing in the gardens. Alexandra organizing their rooms, overseeing their education, fussing over them like any mother would. But Alexei had hemophilia, a genetic disease passed down through Alexandra's line from Queen Victoria. Any small cut or bruise could potentially be fatal. He lived in constant danger, and his parents lived in constant fear. They became isolated, paranoid, desperately searching for anyone who could help their son. And that's how they fell under the influence of Grigory Rasputin, a self-proclaimed holy man who seemed to have an ability to ease Alexei's symptoms. Whether through hypnosis, through luck, through some genuine gift, Rasputin became indispensable to Alexandra, and his influence over the royal family became a scandal that further damaged the dynasty's reputation. Meanwhile, Russia was changing. Industrialization was creating a new, urban working class. Universities were producing students who read Marx and dreamed of revolution. The gap between the wealth of the aristocracy and the poverty of the masses was becoming impossible to ignore. And Nicholas, like his ancestors, seemed utterly unable to grasp the seriousness of the situation. In 1905, after a disastrous war with Japan, revolution erupted across Russia. Workers went on strike. Peasants attacked landlords' estates. On January 22nd, a peaceful demonstration of workers marched to the Winter Palace to petition the Tsar for better conditions. Nicholas wasn't even there. He was at the Alexander Palace, but his troops were. They opened fire on the crowd. Hundreds died. It became known as Bloody Sunday, and it destroyed whatever remaining faith the common people had in the Tsar as their protector and father. Nicholas was forced to grant some reforms, to create a parliament, the Duma, though he made sure it had limited power, and spent the next years trying to undermine it. He simply couldn't imagine giving up real authority. The idea was incomprehensible to him. He was the Tsar. God had chosen him. The empire was his to rule as he saw fit. And through all of this, the palaces continued. Renovations, acquisitions, parties, balls. In 1913, the Romanovs celebrated 300 years of their dynasty with enormous festivities. Nicholas and Alexandra and their children dressed in the costumes of the 17th century, recreating the glory of their ancestors. They hosted balls in the Winter Palace that cost fortunes. They commissioned special performances. They toured the country, accepting the cheers of carefully selected crowds. They convinced themselves that the people still loved them, that the revolutionaries were a tiny minority, that everything would be fine. 1 year later, World War I began. Russia entered the conflict allied with France and Britain against Germany and Austria-Hungary. And this was the beginning of the end. The war went catastrophically. Russian armies were poorly equipped, poorly led, poorly supplied. Millions of men died. The economy collapsed. Food shortages hit the cities. And Nicholas, in an act of stunning foolishness, took personal command of the armies in 1915, making himself personally responsible for every defeat. He left Alexandra in charge in St. Petersburg, and she, guided by Rasputin, made a series of disastrous decisions, firing competent ministers and replacing them with incompetents. The rumors about her relationship with Rasputin, the whispers that she was a German spy, the growing conviction that the monarchy was not just incompetent but actively dangerous, all of this spread through society like poison. In December 1916, a group of nobles murdered Rasputin, trying to break his influence over Alexandra. They poisoned him, shot him, and finally dumped his body in the Neva River. But it was too late. The damage was done. The monarchy's credibility was destroyed. In March 1917, revolution came to St. Petersburg, now renamed Petrograd. Workers went on strike. Soldiers mutinied and joined the protesters instead of shooting them. The city descended into chaos, and Nicholas, at his military headquarters, seemed unable to comprehend what was happening. He tried to return to Petrograd, but his train was stopped. The Duma told him the situation was impossible. His own generals, his own family members, told him he had to abdicate. On March 15, 1917, in a railway car, Nicholas signed the document that ended 300 years of Romanov rule. He gave up the throne for himself and his son. His brother Michael refused to take it. The monarchy was over. Nicholas and his family were placed under house arrest, first at the Alexander Palace, then later moved to Tobolsk in Siberia. They were still treated relatively well at first. They had servants, they could walk in the gardens, they even had some of their belongings with them. But as the months passed, as the provisional government that had replaced the Tsar was itself overthrown by the Bolsheviks under Lenin, as Russia descended into civil war, their situation became more precarious. In April 1918, they were moved to Yekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. They were imprisoned in a house that had been requisitioned from a local merchant. The windows were whitewashed, so they couldn't see out. Guards watched them constantly. Their movements were restricted. The guards would sometimes harass them, write crude graffiti about Alexandra on the walls. The family tried to maintain some dignity, to keep to their routines, to pray together, to stay hopeful. But the Bolsheviks had a problem. The White Army, loyal to the old regime, was advancing on Yekaterinburg. If they captured the city, they might rescue Nicholas and his family. The Whites could use the former Tsar as a rallying point, a symbol around which to organize opposition to the Bolshevik Revolution. Lenin and his colleagues couldn't allow that. The order came down from Moscow. The Tsar and his family were to be executed. Not tried, not sent into exile, executed. All of them. The Tsar, the Tsarina, their 5 children, and even the few loyal servants who had stayed with them. On the night of July 16, 1918, the family was woken and told they needed to move to the basement because there was unrest in the town. They dressed and went downstairs, Nicholas carrying his son Alexei, who was too ill to walk. They were told to wait in a small room while trucks were arranged. Alexandra asked for chairs, and 2 were brought. She and Alexei sat. The rest of the family stood behind them. And then the execution squad entered. There were 11 men. They had been drinking to steel their nerves. The commandant read a quick statement. The family barely had time to react before the shooting started. Nicholas died instantly from the first bullet. Alexandra and the children tried to shield themselves, but there was nowhere to go. The room filled with smoke and screams. Some of the bullets ricocheted off jewels that the daughters had sewn into their clothes as a last attempt to preserve something of value. The shooting seemed to go on forever. When it finally stopped, some of the family members were still alive, wounded, moaning. The guards finished them with bayonets. The bodies were loaded onto a truck and driven to a forest outside the city. There, the Bolsheviks tried to destroy the evidence. They stripped the bodies, burned them, poured acid on them, smashed the bones. Finally, they threw what remained into a mineshaft, then later moved them to a hastily dug grave. They wanted the Romanovs to disappear completely, to become nothing, to be forgotten. For decades, the Soviet government denied that the children had been killed. They claimed that only Nicholas had been executed, that the family had been evacuated safely. False stories circulated about surviving Romanovs, imposters, claiming to be Anastasia or Alexei. The truth remained buried, literally and figuratively. In 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the remains were finally found. DNA testing confirmed that these were indeed the Romanovs. In 1998, they were given a state burial in St. Petersburg, in the cathedral where most of the Romanov Tsars were buried. In 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church canonized them as passion bearers, martyrs who faced death with dignity. But let's go back to those palaces. Because here's the truly haunting part of this story. While the Romanovs were being murdered in that basement in Yekaterinburg, their palaces still stood. The Winter Palace had already been stormed during the October Revolution of 1917, when the Bolsheviks seized power. The famous scene, immortalized in Eisenstein's film, of revolutionary soldiers pouring through those grand halls, running up that magnificent staircase, invading the throne room, arresting the provisional government. The Bolsheviks initially planned to destroy everything, to erase every trace of the old regime. Some palaces were vandalized, some treasures were stolen or sold off. But then a strange thing happened. They realized that these palaces, these symbols of oppression and excess, could be repurposed. They could become museums, monuments to the people, proof of how far Russia had come. The Winter Palace became the Hermitage Museum, open to everyone. The Catherine Palace became a tourist destination. Peterhof, the Alexander Palace, all of them were transformed from private residences of the imperial family into public spaces. The message was clear. These places that had once been forbidden to ordinary Russians, these monuments to inequality and privilege, now belonged to everyone. World War II brought new devastation. When the Nazis invaded, they systematically destroyed what they could. Peterhof was almost completely demolished. The Catherine Palace was burned. Park sculptures were melted down. The restoration work that followed was monumental, taking decades, involving thousands of craftsmen and artists working from old photographs and documents to recreate what had been lost. Today, if you visit these palaces, you see something strange. You see rooms that have been restored to their original glory, that gleam with gold and marble and silk. But you also see emptiness. These are museums now, not homes. There are no imperial residents, no grand balls, no children playing in the halls. They're beautiful, but they're also hollow, like elaborate stage sets after the play has ended. And maybe that's fitting. Maybe that emptiness is the real lesson here. All that wealth, all that power, all those palaces and treasures and symbols of divine right, they couldn't save the Romanovs. They couldn't prevent the revolution. They couldn't stop those bullets in that basement. If anything, they contributed to the dynasty's downfall. Every golden room, every elaborate fountain, every ton of amber, they were proof of a system that took everything from the many to give to the very few. There's a particular irony in the fact that Nicholas II, the last Tsar, the man who died in that basement, he actually preferred the Alexander Palace precisely because it was smaller, more intimate, less overwhelming than the other imperial residences. He wanted to be a family man. He wanted to play with his children, to have quiet evenings with his wife, to live something approaching a normal life. But he couldn't. The weight of 300 years of tradition, of expectation, of those palaces and all they represented, it crushed him. In his diaries, which survived, Nicholas comes across as almost painfully ordinary. He writes about the weather. He writes about walks in the garden. He writes about small domestic details. There's very little of the grand historical events, very little recognition that the world was changing around him. He was trapped in his bubble, in his palace, unable or unwilling to see what was coming. Alexandra was even more isolated. She genuinely believed that the Russian people loved the Tsar, that it was all the fault of revolutionaries and intellectuals and foreigners. She couldn't comprehend that the system itself was the problem. When they were under house arrest, she would sometimes talk about how everything would be fine once this unpleasantness was over, how they would return to their normal lives, how the people would come to their senses. She never accepted reality, not until those final moments in that basement. The children, they were perhaps the most innocent victims of all this. The four daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, and the young Alexei, they had no choice in any of this. They were born into their roles. They lived in palaces, yes, but they were also prisoners of those palaces in a way. Their lives were controlled, regulated, surrounded by protocol and expectation. The photographs show them looking happy, playing, but there's also something sad in those images when you know how their story ends. During their imprisonment, the family tried to maintain hope. They prayed together, they read to each other, they performed small plays. Nicholas chopped wood for exercise. The daughters helped with cooking and cleaning, things they had never had to do before. In a twisted way, those final months might have been when they were most like a normal family, stripped of servants and ceremony, just 7 people trying to stay together in terrible circumstances. But normal families don't get executed in basements. Let's talk about what those palaces cost. Not just in rubles, though the figures are staggering when you try to calculate them, but in human terms. Every golden room required gold miners working in dangerous conditions. Every marble staircase required quarrymen cutting stone. Every elaborate parquet floor required foresters and woodworkers. Every silk wall covering required silkworms and weavers. Every painting in the Hermitage collection required not just the artist, but the entire economy that supported art patronage. And all of it, was built on the backs of people who would never see the inside of these palaces, who would never benefit from the wealth they helped create. The serfs who worked the fields, who paid their taxes, who gave their sons to the army, who lived in wooden huts that burned down regularly, who faced famines and epidemics with little help from the government. The workers in the new factories, who labored 14, 16 hours a day for wages that barely kept them alive. The peasants who were conscripted into wars they didn't understand, fighting for a czar they would never meet, dying in mud and blood far from home. This is the dark story of the Romanov Palaces. Not just that they were excessive, though they were. Not just that they symbolized inequality, though they did, but that they were built at the expense of millions of people who had no voice, no choice, no escape from the system that exploited them. And when those people finally had enough, when they decided they would no longer accept their place at the bottom of this hierarchy, the entire structure collapsed. The revolution, when it came, was incredibly violent. The civil war that followed the Bolshevik takeover lasted for years and killed millions. The new Soviet government proved to be just as brutal as the old regime, perhaps more so. Stalin's purges, the famines, the gulags, the Soviet Union under communism was hardly a worker's paradise, trading one form of tyranny for another. But here's the thing. The Romanovs made that revolution almost inevitable. Their refusal to reform, their insistence on maintaining absolute power, their obliviousness to the suffering of their subjects, all of it created the conditions where violent revolution became the only option people saw. If Nicholas had been willing to become a constitutional monarch, if he had implemented real reforms, if he had shown genuine concern for his subjects instead of just symbolic paternalism, maybe things would have been different. But he couldn't. He was the Tsar. He lived in palaces. He was chosen by God. How could he compromise with revolutionaries and radicals? How could he give up power that was rightfully his? The very idea was incomprehensible within the worldview that 300 years of palaces and privilege had created. There's a small museum in Yekaterinburg now, at the site where the Romanovs were executed. The house itself was demolished by the Soviet government, but a church stands there now, the Church on the Blood. Inside, you can see photographs of the family. You can read about their final days. It's somber, respectful, mournful. The local monarchists consider it a holy site. They come to pray, to light candles, to mourn the imperial family. But there's debate, even now, about how to remember the Romanovs. Were they martyrs, innocent victims of a brutal ideology, or were they symbols of an oppressive system that deserved to fall? Can they be both? The answer probably is complicated. Nicholas and Alexandra and their children were human beings who suffered terribly and died violently. That's a tragedy regardless of your political views. But they were also representatives of a system that caused immense suffering to millions. Their personal kindness, Nicholas's love for his family, Alexandra's devotion to her son, these things are real and genuine. But they don't erase the larger context of what the Romanov dynasty represented. Back to those palaces. You can visit them today. You can walk through those golden rooms, climb those marble staircases, see those paintings and sculptures and elaborate decorations. Tourists from around the world come to St. Petersburg specifically to see these palaces. They're some of Russia's most popular attractions. People take selfies in the throne room. They post photos of the Amber Room on Instagram. They marvel at the fountains of Peterhof. And maybe that's the final twist in this story. These palaces that were built as private spaces for the imperial family, these symbols of exclusivity and privilege, they've become shared cultural heritage. They belong to everyone now, or at least to everyone who can afford a ticket. They're no longer tools of power, but objects of beauty and historical interest. But we shouldn't forget what they cost. We shouldn't forget the workers who built them, the people whose labor and taxes paid for them, the suffering that made them possible. We shouldn't let the beauty blind us to the darkness behind it. There's a concept in psychology called the overview effect. Astronauts who see Earth from space often report a profound shift in perspective, a realization of how small and fragile and interconnected everything is. The Romanovs needed an overview effect. They needed to see outside their palaces to understand that their subjects weren't different beings, inferior creatures meant to serve and obey. They were people, with the same hopes and fears and desires, people who deserved dignity and opportunity and a voice in their own governance. But the palaces prevented that overview. The palaces kept the Romanovs isolated, surrounded by people who told them what they wanted to hear, insulated from the reality of their empire. And that isolation, that bubble of luxury and privilege, it was as deadly as any assassin's bullet. It killed them long before they reached that basement. In the end, those mansions the Tsars died for, they weren't just physical structures. They were a mindset. They were an ideology. They were the embodiment of the belief that some people are simply more valuable than others, that hierarchy is natural and good, that luxury for a few is worth suffering for many. That ideology killed the Romanovs. And the tragic thing is, they never saw it coming. They thought the palaces kept them safe, kept them elevated above the chaos of normal life. But in reality, the palaces were a trap, a beautiful, golden, elaborate trap that held them until the revolution caught up with them. Today, you can stand in that throne room in the Winter Palace and imagine what it must have been like. The balls, the ceremonies, the sense of power and permanence. You can walk through the Catherine Palace and marvel at the restored amber room, glowing just as it did centuries ago. You can stroll through the gardens of Peterhof and watch the fountains play, the water glittering in the sun. But if you pay attention, if you really think about what these places represent, you should also feel a chill. You should see the ghosts, not just the ghosts of Nicholas and Alexandra and their children, though they're there too, but the ghosts of everyone who suffered to build and maintain these palaces, the ghosts of everyone who starved while the aristocracy feasted, the ghosts of everyone who died in wars started by men who lived in palaces and never had to face the consequences. These palaces are beautiful. Let's not pretend otherwise. The artistry, the craftsmanship, the sheer ambition of creating something so elaborate, it's genuinely impressive. But beauty can be seductive. Beauty can make us forget. Beauty can distract us from asking uncomfortable questions about where that beauty came from and what it cost. The dark story of the Romanov Palaces is ultimately a story about power and its consequences, about what happens when a small group of people control all the resources and use them to create monuments to themselves, about how privilege and isolation can blind you to reality until it's too late, about how systems that seem permanent and unshakable can collapse with shocking speed when people decide they've had enough. And it's a warning. Not that we should tear down beautiful things or reject art and architecture and culture, but that we should never forget the human cost behind them. That we should never accept systems that concentrate wealth and power so extremely that some people live in palaces while others struggle to survive. That we should remember that no amount of gold or marble or amber can protect you if you've built your palace on a foundation of injustice. The Romanovs built mansions fit for gods. They decorated them with treasures from around the world. They lived lives of unimaginable luxury. And in the end, none of it mattered. They died in a basement, executed by men who saw them not as divine rulers, but as symbols of everything wrong with the old world. Those palaces still stand. Tourists still come. The fountains still flow. The gold still gleams. But the dynasty is gone. The system that created these palaces is gone. What remains are beautiful shells, memorials to a vanished world, reminders of what happens when excess becomes so extreme that it loses touch with humanity. That's the dark story. That's what those mansions cost. Not just money, not just labor, but ultimately everything. The Romanovs lost their empire, their throne, their lives. And all those palaces couldn't save them. All that gold couldn't protect them. All that beauty couldn't prevent the darkness that was coming. Sometimes late at night, when the tourists have gone home and the lights are off, you can almost feel it in those rooms. The weight of history, the sorrow of lives cut short, the echo of those final gunshots in that basement in Yekaterinburg. The palaces remember, even if we sometimes forget. They remember who built them and who died for them and what they truly cost. And maybe that's why we need to keep telling this story. Not to romanticize the Romanovs or to justify the violence of the revolution, but to remember, to understand, to learn. Because human nature hasn't changed. The temptation to build palaces, literal or metaphorical, to separate ourselves from others, to convince ourselves that we deserve more because we're special or chosen or superior, that temptation is still there. It's always there. The dark story of the Romanov Palaces teaches us that no palace walls are strong enough to hold back history when it comes calling. That isolation and privilege don't protect you, they make you vulnerable. That beauty built on suffering is fragile, no matter how solid it seems. That in the end, we're all just human beings, and no amount of gold or power or divine right can change that fundamental truth. Those mansions the Tsars died for stand today as monuments. But what they're monuments to depends on how we choose to see them. Are they celebrations of artistic achievement, warnings about excess, memorials to victims of revolution, evidence of an unjust system? Maybe they're all of those things. Maybe the complexity is the point. What's certain is this: the Romanovs are gone. Their dynasty is history. Their empire has been dead for over a century. But their palaces remain, beautiful and terrible, glittering reminders of humanity's capacity for both creation and destruction, for both sublime artistry and profound injustice. And as long as those palaces stand, we'll keep trying to understand what they mean, what they cost, and what they can teach us about power and privilege and the price that people pay for the dreams of emperors.